He walked into the dojo unnoticed, but what happened next left everyone speechless. Watch until the end. This is a story you'll never forget. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. The letter came on a rainy Tuesday morning, just as Chuck Norris was finishing his second cup of coffee and looking out the window of his modest Texas home. The sky outside was painted in shades of dull gray, the kind that made the world seem hushed and reflective. He picked up the envelope from the edge of the table. There was no return address, only his name written in a neat, slanted hand that felt strangely familiar. The paper inside was folded precisely, as if the sender had taken great care with every crease. He unfolded it and began to read. The words were simple, but carried weight. It was from Kenji Matsuda, a man he hadn't seen in over 40 years, a friend from his Air Force days in Japan. Kenji had been a quiet man back then, a translator who had introduced Chuck to his first martial arts instructor, Master Lee. In the letter, Kenji wrote about his grandson Daiki, a boy of 10 with a heart full of fire, but a body that didn't move the way others did. "He tries," the letter read. "He tries harder than anyone, but he's losing faith. I thought of you, old friend. You who once fell 100 times and stood up 101. I thought maybe, if you ever passed through, he could see you. Just once. Just watching from the back." Chuck read those lines twice, then again. He set the paper down and sat in silence. He wasn't used to requests like this anymore. These days, his name mostly lived in exaggerated memes and old action films. He was, in many ways, a myth, more punchline than person. But here was a request not for a performance, not for a signature, but for a silent act of presence. He didn't answer the letter that day. Instead, he went out back and trained. Slow movements, simple forms, kata he hadn't practiced in years. His body ached more than it used to. His knees complained, and his balance wasn't as sharp, but his mind still understood the rhythm. He thought of the first time he met Master Lee. He'd been a hot-headed airman, overconfident and stiff. The master had barely said 10 words during their first session. He just pointed at a spot on the mat and said, "Kick." Chuck had kicked and fallen, and kicked again, for hours. That lesson had shaped everything, not because it was flashy, because it was real. The next morning, Chuck packed a small duffel bag and took to the road. No one knew where he was going. He didn't announce it on social media or call ahead. This wasn't a visit for attention. It was a visit of intention. The dojo was in a mid-sized town a few states over, nestled between a dry cleaner's and a ramen shop. The sign above the door read Watanabe Martial Arts Academy in electric blue. It flickered slightly, as if unsure whether to stay lit. Chuck stood across the street for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the students inside through the front glass. It was a modern place, filled with energy. Kids and teens in bright uniforms moved in sharp unison across a polished wooden floor. Mirrors lined the walls, reflecting their discipline. In one corner stood a trophy case that glittered under spotlights. Tall gold statues, plaques, and certificates. The kind of display that spoke of ambition, of victory. He crossed the street, stepped inside, and removed his shoes without a word. No one noticed him at first, and that suited him fine. The air inside was thick with effort, the kind of heat that only comes from repetition, from pushing oneself beyond comfort. He walked to the edge of the mat and stopped, arms folded lightly, eyes scanning the room not for technique, but for truth. That's when he saw him. A boy, small for his age, his white headband slightly askew, his punches not quite aligned with the rest of the class. His movements were awkward, unrefined, but what struck Chuck wasn't the imperfection. It was the persistence. The boy kept trying. Even when his front kick wobbled, even when he fell behind, he corrected himself, reset his stance, tried again. Chuck's lips curved into a faint smile. That, right there, was why he had come. That was what martial arts were about. Not the polished trophy on a shelf, not the roar of a crowd, but a single child, drenched in sweat, refusing to quit. As he watched, he felt the distant echo of his own youth. A barefoot kid with a GI 2 sizes too big throwing a crooked punch under the critical eye of Master Lee. He could still hear the cicadas outside that open-window dojo in South Korea. Could still feel the sting of a correction, the deep satisfaction when the movement finally clicked. He didn't notice the sensei at first, not until the man clapped sharply and brought the room to a halt. Students froze mid-pose. The sensei stood tall, in a GI trimmed with gold and red, a thick black belt tied in a perfect knot. His presence commanded attention. He turned, finally noticing the man standing at the edge of his mat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The students watched, curious. The sensei smiled politely. "Welcome to Watanabe Martial Arts Academy," he said. "Can I help you, sir?" Chuck simply inclined his head. "Don't let me interrupt," he replied. "I'm just here to watch." There was a pause. The sensei's smile tightened slightly. Visitors weren't common, especially ones who came unannounced, especially ones who spoke so softly. "We don't usually allow spectators," the sensei said, "unless they're interested in enrolling." Chuck glanced at the boy with the white headband who now stood motionless, caught between embarrassment and curiosity. "I came to watch a child train," Chuck said. The sensei raised an eyebrow. The students murmured. The dojo shifted ever so slightly, and something unspoken, the first ripple in still waters, began to move. The tension in the room was subtle at first, like a faint vibration beneath the surface. No one could quite place it, but they felt it all the same. Sensei Amaru Watanabe stood tall at the front of the room, his polished black belt cinched tight, his arms folded across his broad chest. His GI shimmered under the ceiling lights, red and gold embroidery outlining the crests of the academy. He glanced once more at the man on the edge of the mat, the man who'd come in without introduction, without fanfare, and yet somehow pulled the air toward himself like gravity. The students looked back and forth between the two men, sensing something unspoken. Chuck Norris stood calm, his hands now lightly clasped in front of him, not a trace of challenge in his posture. But there was something in his presence, a stillness that felt ancient, like the eye of a storm. Watanabe cleared his throat and gestured to the class. "As I was saying," he resumed with forced ease, "precision comes from repetition. Let's return to our kickin' drills." The students moved, some slower than others, casting occasional glances at the man still standing quietly at the edge. But Chuck's gaze had returned to Daiki. The boy was trying harder now, stealing glances at his grandfather's mysterious friend. There was new fire in his kicks, even if they still trembled. Chuck nodded slowly to himself. Yes, the boy had heart. A few minutes passed. Then Watanabe stopped the drills again. He turned toward Chuck, smiling politely. "Forgive me, but you look familiar," he said. "Have we met before?" Chuck hesitated, as he often did in moments like this. He didn't like to announce himself. He preferred the myth to remain in shadows. "Maybe," he said simply. But Watanabe wasn't one to let mystery hang for long. His ego, honed sharp by years of applause, couldn't resist. He took a step forward. "You're Chuck Norris, aren't you?" A gasp fluttered through the class. Even the assistant instructors stirred. The name rippled through the ranks of students like wind through grass. Some of the older ones recognized it instantly. The younger ones, less so, but they recognized the reactions. Chuck offered a modest nod, his half-smile giving nothing away. "I'm Chuck," he said. Watanabe's eyes flickered with something new. Not fear, not exactly, but calculation. The kind of mental shift that turns a moment into an opportunity. "It's an honor," the sensei said, bowing his head slightly. "We're always pleased to welcome fellow martial artists here. Perhaps you'd be willing to share a bit of your knowledge with the class." The offer was laced with politeness, but Chuck felt the edge beneath it. He knew this dance. He'd seen it in countless dojos. The host feeling his spotlight dimming, reaching for control by offering the illusion of generosity. Chuck thought for a moment, then nodded. "Just something simple," he said. "A basic technique. Fundamentals." Watanabe gestured graciously toward the center mat. "The floor is yours." Chuck stepped forward. The students parted as he walked, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognized instinctively that he should be there. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago mastered not just his body, but the space around him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or posture. Instead, he began to demonstrate a basic front stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees bent slightly, one hand in guard, the other extended in a fist. "This is where it all begins," he said calmly. "Every trophy, every belt, every fight starts right here." He demonstrated a slow, precise punch, then another, then a roundhouse kick, not high or flashy, just clean and effective. The students watched in total silence. Even the assistant instructors had stopped moving. Watanabe stood with his arms crossed, smiling stiffly. Chuck finished the short demonstration and stepped back. "Power," he said, "isn't in the noise, it's in the control." Then he bowed. The room remained still for a long second before Watanabe clapped. "Wonderful," he said. "Thank you for that reminder. Basics are important, of course, but we also believe in expanding beyond them, reaching for the extraordinary." He gestured once more to the trophy case where the gold gleamed like metals in sunlight. Chuck followed his gesture but said nothing. He had no need to compete. His message had already landed. But Watanabe wasn't ready to give up the floor. "Would you perhaps consider a light sparring demonstration?" he asked with a bright smile. "I think the students would learn a lot from seeing you in action. Just something friendly." The class murmured again, this time louder. Chuck hesitated. He hadn't come for this. He hadn't come to fight. But then he looked at Daiki again. The boy was standing straighter than before, eyes wide with wonder. Something in Chuck's chest softened. Maybe this lesson needed to be taught in a language the dojo understood. He gave a slow nod. "If it helps them learn," he said. Watanabe's eyes gleamed. He bowed again. "Excellent," he said, clapping once. "Prepare the mat." Students quickly shifted to the perimeter, clearing the center. Phones slipped into hands despite rules. The assistant instructor brought over 2 pairs of sparring gloves, but Chuck waved them off politely. "Let's keep it simple," he said. "Just hands. No full contact." Watanabe agreed with a nod, though inside he was already imagining the headlines, the videos, the fame. This was his dojo, his home. He wouldn't lose here. The 2 men stepped onto the mat. They bowed to each other. The air thickened. Something unsaid passed between them. And then, like the first drop before a storm, the sparring began. The air inside the dojo had shifted entirely. What was once a training space now felt like a coliseum. Though no one cheered or spoke aloud, the room buzzed with anticipation. Students lined the edge of the mat, standing or kneeling with bated breath. Phones were discreetly angled from laps and sleeves despite the academy's usual strict policy against recording. But none of that mattered now. This wasn't just a class anymore. This was Chuck Norris. Sensei Watanabe stood tall in his place across from Chuck, rolling his shoulders, loosening his neck, cracking his knuckles with deliberate showmanship. His black tank top revealed a well-maintained physique, sculpted by years of high-level training. He bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, eyes locked on Chuck, measuring him. Chuck stood calmly, hands open at his sides, feet shoulder-width apart. No bounce, no flash, just stillness. He looked like he was waiting for a conversation to begin, not a match. And perhaps he was. Watanabe tilted his head slightly and smirked, the smirk of a man who had always known he was the fastest in the room. "Begin," he said, without waiting for anyone else to declare it. He struck first. A quick advance, testing range, then a sharp jab toward Chuck's chest. Chuck leaned slightly back, letting the fist pass within inches of his shirt. Watanabe didn't slow. He followed with a hook aimed at Chuck's left shoulder, sharp and fast. Chuck stepped to the side, the punch missing as if it had been thrown into smoke. A few students gasped softly, not because the punch missed, but because it missed without Chuck doing anything dramatic. He had simply not been there when it arrived. Watanabe circled, lips pressing together, pushing down the twinge of annoyance. Again, a leg sweep. Chuck stepped over it. A kick to the ribs. Chuck dropped his elbow just enough to deflect the blow. Every strike was fast, crisp, and calculated, but none of them landed. Chuck moved like wind, never resisting, never colliding, just flowing around each incoming technique with uncanny ease. To most in the room, it looked like magic. To the trained eye, it was mastery, pure, distilled economy of movement. The basics performed with such precision and timing that they became invisible. Watanabe was growing warmer now, his breathing a little heavier, sweat collecting at his brow. He hadn't expected this. He had expected resistance. Blocks, counters, something to clash against. But Chuck offered none. Only space. And in that space, Watanabe found himself tiring and thinking. Too much. A low spinning kick, followed by a high back fist. Chuck ducked under the fist while his hand guided the kick away like turning a doorknob. Watanabe stumbled half a step. Chuck didn't follow, didn't strike. He just returned to center, watching, not mocking, simply observing. That was worse somehow, as if Chuck wasn't even trying. The students didn't laugh, they didn't whisper. They were too focused. Even the assistant instructors were frozen. Daiki stood in front, wide-eyed, clutching his old frayed belt in both hands, watching a man he'd only heard about in stories move like something out of a dream. Watanabe stepped back, nodding as if to reset. His pride burned behind his eyes. He could feel it, his reputation slipping, student by student, not because he was being beaten, but because he was being unraveled. Still, he wasn't done. He inhaled, set his stance, and launched into one of his signature sequences. A blur of motion, a feint, a side kick, a spin, a back fist, and a high roundhouse kick. The kind of combination that won him trophies. Chuck saw it coming, not in arrogance but through experience. He stepped into the final spin, letting Watanabe's foot miss him by inches. Then, with a soft pivot of his own foot and a low sweep, Chuck tapped the back of Watanabe's supporting leg. Just a touch, just enough. Watanabe's balance faltered. His planted foot shifted too far to recover. He stumbled, arms flailing for a heartbeat, and fell. The room went dead silent. He hit the mat with a muffled thud, and even the buzz of the neon sign outside seemed to pause. Chuck stood motionless. His right leg still extended slightly in the sweep position, his left hand loosely raised, not in threat, but in readiness. Watanabe blinked, breathing fast, confused more by the ease of it than the fact that it happened. Then he looked up and saw Chuck's foot hovering just inches from his face. A perfect roundhouse, halted mid-motion. It hadn't landed, but it could have. Everyone in the room understood that, Watanabe most of all. Chuck held the position for a moment, then slowly lowered his leg. He stepped back, offered his hand. Watanabe hesitated. His heart pounded with rage and shame, but somewhere beneath that, something softer stirred. He took the hand. Chuck pulled him up effortlessly. There was no condescension in his touch, just strength, mutual respect freely offered. Watanabe bowed, not quickly, not shallowly. He bent at the waist, a long, deep bow, the kind that says more than words. Chuck returned the bow, slightly shorter but sincere. Around them the dojo remained frozen. Then, as if on cue, the students, every one of them, lined up at the edge of the mat, dropped to their knees and bowed together. Some touched their foreheads to the ground. It was a gesture of complete respect, not just for the victor, but for the spirit behind the victory. Daiki stayed in his bow longer than anyone, his small body shaking slightly, overwhelmed. Chuck looked at them, expression unreadable, then turned to Watanabe. Their eyes met. Watanabe gave a small nod, one filled not with surrender, but with humility. For the first time in years, he felt like a student again. And it didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. Silence hung heavy in the dojo after the bow, not the awkward silence of confusion or fear, but something deeper, almost sacred. It pressed gently against the walls, carried in the breath of each student, in the unmoving stillness of Chuck Norris, and in the subdued posture of Sensei Watanabe, who remained standing beside the man who had just effortlessly dismantled him without a single aggressive strike. Watanabe's chest rose and fell, sweat still beading across his brow and running down his spine. His mouth was dry. His arms hung loose at his sides, no longer tense with pride or ready to perform. He looked at Chuck, trying to mask the whirlwind inside. He had not just been outclassed, he had been unmasked. And what Chuck had shown him, what the entire room had seen, was not a spectacle. It was a reflection, the kind a man usually avoids. Watanabe had built his life on sharp techniques and shining trophies. His dojo was known for its results, for winners, for titles. He prided himself on teaching his students the power of dominance, of asserting strength. And yet, here stood Chuck Norris, who had demonstrated something far more profound. He had not asserted anything. He had absorbed, redirected, and, in the most subtle of ways, revealed that Watanabe's foundation, though solid, had grown crooked. Chuck stepped back from the mat and gave a soft nod toward the students still kneeling. "Thank you," he said. His voice, as ever, was calm and modest, carrying just enough strength to reach everyone without needing to rise. He turned slightly toward Watanabe. "Thank you for letting me share." Watanabe swallowed. His mouth opened to speak, but no words came. He looked at his students. They were watching, and for the first time they weren't looking at him with idolizing awe. It was something else now. Respect, yes, but laced with something more mature. As if they had grown up a little during the match, as if the myth of their invincible sensei had shattered, but in its place stood something stronger, someone human. Watanabe inhaled, then bowed again. Lower this time. "Thank you, Mr. Norris," he said loud enough for all to hear, "not for the demonstration, but for the lesson." There was a pause. Then applause broke out. Not chaotic, not wild, just a swelling sound of palms meeting, carried by gratitude. Even the assistant instructors joined, nodding, clapping, eyes gleaming with something between humility and inspiration. Chuck nodded but did not bask. He turned to gather his jacket from the edge of the room. But before he could leave, a small figure approached him. Daiki. The boy stood clutching something in his hand, a white belt, frayed and stained. It was too small to be his current belt, likely his first one. His eyes were wide but steady. "Mr. Norris," Daiki said, his voice trembling slightly, Could you sign this?" Chuck took the belt gently, studying it. The boy's name was already scribbled on the inside in faint black marker, likely written by Daiki himself when he first earned it. Chuck smiled, pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, and carefully wrote his name below the child's. Then he hesitated for a moment, thoughtful. He added something else beneath it. 3 short words in neat Vietnamese characters. Daiki tilted his head. "What does that mean?" Chuck returned the belt and placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "It's something your grandfather will be able to explain better, but I'll tell you this, it means—" The silence was the loudest lesson. Daiki blinked, mouthing the words in English, trying to hold them in his mind like a new kata. He nodded solemnly. Chuck squeezed his shoulder once, then stepped back. The students watched as he turned toward the exit. He walked slowly, not from exhaustion, but because the moment itself didn't deserve haste. Watanabe followed him a few steps. "Mr. Norris," he said quietly, just for Chuck's ears, "I owe you an apology. I didn't challenge you for my students. I did it for myself, for my ego." Chuck turned, meeting his gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, only quiet understanding. "I've been there," Chuck said. "We all get there at some point." Watanabe looked down briefly. "Would you come back again? Not for another match, but maybe to teach, even just to speak." Chuck considered it, then smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but no promises. I tend to show up where I'm needed, not always where I'm expected." Watanabe gave a single laugh, small but sincere. "That sounds about right." Chuck's eyes drifted back toward Daiki, who was now animatedly whispering to another student, mimicking some of the movements he'd seen during the spar. The innocence of it stirred something inside him. "He's got heart," Chuck said. "That's what matters." Watanabe nodded. "We'll take good care of him." "I know you will," Chuck said. "You're already different now." That stopped Watanabe. He felt the truth of it in his chest. Not different in skill, but in purpose. Chuck stepped to the door and reached for the handle. The evening beyond was dark, a soft wind slipping through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of rain and city air. He paused, looked back once. The dojo behind him was quiet again, but alive. A space changed not by violence, but by humility. He gave a final nod, then stepped out into the night. The door slid shut behind him with a quiet thud, and inside the dojo no one spoke for a long moment. They didn't need to. Watanabe looked around the room, saw his students, their eyes on him, not with worship, but with trust. Real trust, the kind earned not through dominance, but through honesty. He bowed once more, not to Chuck, not to the room, but to the lesson, to what had been broken inside him and what had just begun to rebuild. Outside, Chuck walked down the street, his jacket tight against the wind, his steps slow, steady, and at peace. The air inside the dojo felt different now, as if the very walls had absorbed the energy of what had just occurred. The students, still processing the silent intensity of Chuck's sparring and the humility of their own sensei, stood in small clusters. No one laughed, no one rushed. Even those who had been recording with their phones now held them loosely, unsure whether to upload what they had captured or keep it as a personal memory too sacred to share. Sensei Watanabe remained near the center of the mat, his breathing now steady, his heartbeat slowly returning to normal. Sweat clung to his skin, not from exertion, but from the emotional weight of the moment. Around him, his students lingered, clearly waiting for his lead. He had never before felt so aware of their eyes, not as admirers of his titles, but as witnesses of his vulnerability. And still, none of them turned away. If anything, they stood closer. Chuck Norris had left without ceremony. There had been no grand farewell, no theatrical bow, just a nod, a shared glance with Daiki, and a silent departure into the darkening evening. But in his wake, he had left something behind, something heavier than trophies, more valuable than belts, the kind of lesson that could only be delivered without words. Watanabe slowly turned to face his students. They stood still, not out of discipline, but respect. He had taught them technique. Chuck had taught them meaning. Watanabe took a long breath and raised his voice, not loud, not booming, but clear. "Class," he began, "I want to speak with you." Every head lifted, every eye fixed on him. He paused, searching for the right words, then allowed himself to speak from a place he hadn't accessed in years. "What you witnessed today was not a fight. It wasn't a show, and it wasn't a test of strength." He let the silence breathe before continuing. "It was a reflection. One I needed more than any of you." His gaze swept across their faces. Some students nodded slightly, others just listened, still digesting. "For years," he said, "I believed that victory defined us, that medals and titles were the measure of progress. And yes, we trained hard, we achieved much, but somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing. I stopped listening. And I stopped learning." His throat tightened slightly, but he pushed through. "Chuck Norris didn't come here to beat me. He came to remind me of something I had forgotten, that mastery has nothing to prove, that true strength is quiet, patient, and measured, that humility is not weakness, it is wisdom." He looked toward Daiki, who stood near the front still holding the signed white belt. The boy's eyes glistened, though he wasn't crying. His chest was lifted, he looked taller somehow. "You all deserve to train under someone who continues to grow, who admits when he's been wrong. And today, I was wrong. I let pride speak for me, but I promise you now, I will not let pride lead this dojo anymore." There was no applause, just understanding. And that was more powerful than noise. Watanabe stepped forward and bowed low, not as a sensei to his students, but as a man seeking to reclaim the meaning of his own path. The students returned the bow in unison. No command was needed, no cue. The movement was organic, flowing from hearts newly awakened to what martial arts was truly about. Daiki was the last to lift his head. In that moment, Watanabe truly saw him, not as a struggling child, not as a burden to the school's reputation, but as the embodiment of perseverance. The boy who kept kicking when others would have quit. the boy whose effort had silently called a legend into the room. After the bow, the class began to break into smaller groups. Conversations were soft, thoughtful. One by one, the students approached Watanabe, not for correction, not for praise, but to thank him. Not for the match, but for the honesty. A teenage girl named Arissa bowed to him and said, "I didn't know you could lose and still teach us more than ever." A boy who had always tried to outshine others simply said, "I think I finally get it now." Watanabe accepted their words with quiet humility. He didn't deflect them. He didn't turn away. He let them reach him. That evening, after the dojo had emptied and the lights had dimmed, Watanabe stood alone in the center of the mat. The trophy case at the side wall gleamed faintly in the dark, but for once, he didn't glance at it. He looked down at the scuffed surface beneath his feet and remembered how it had felt to be thrown, not just physically, but emotionally, by a man who used no force at all. He thought of the final moment, lying on the mat, Chuck's foot hovering just short of contact, and the question unspoken in his eyes, "Do you yield?" And he had. Not just the fight, but everything he had falsely built upon. He walked over to the wall where a long white scroll had hung for years, an inscription written by his grandfather, "Glory through victory." It had always been the dojo's motto, until now. He took it down. He didn't tear it. He didn't destroy it. He folded it with care, as one would fold a chapter that had been fully read. Then he went to his office, sat at his small desk, and opened a drawer. Inside was a blank scroll tucked away for years, meant for a future vision. Slowly, deliberately, he unrolled it and began to write. His brush moved with a newfound steadiness. Each stroke was clear, purposeful. When he finished, he read the words aloud, quietly, just to himself. Master yourself before mastering others. He hung the scroll the next morning before the students arrived. When they came in, one by one, their gazes drifted toward it. None of them said anything, but they all bowed to it on their way to the mat, not because they were told to, but because they understood. In the days that followed, Watanabe changed the way he taught. He asked more questions. He listened more carefully. He slowed down. The pace of the dojo didn't weaken. It deepened. Students still trained hard. They still sparred. They still pushed themselves. But now, between the shouts and strikes, there was space. Space for reflection, for stillness, for silence. And in that silence, something extraordinary began to grow. The rain came softly that night, a quiet drizzle falling over the rooftops and storefronts of the town. Outside the Watanabe Martial Arts Academy, the neon sign still flickered in blue, but now its glow felt warmer somehow, less like a declaration and more like a welcome. Inside, the dojo stood in near silence. The mats had been cleaned, the mirrors wiped down, and the lights dimmed to a soft glow. Sensei Watanabe stood alone again, the hush of the evening settling around him like a second gi. He moved slowly through a series of forms, nothing flashy, just deliberate stances, slow strikes, precise breathing. With each motion, he felt more grounded, more real. As he moved, the new scroll on the wall swayed gently with the breeze from the open window. Master yourself before mastering others. The words gave him something to reach toward. He no longer needed to pretend he had already arrived. The next morning brought a fresh kind of energy to the dojo. Students arrived early. Some chatted in small groups, but the usual competitive tension was absent. They stretched together, laughed quietly, and when the time came to line up, they did so without command. Wadonab entered, bowed, and stood before them, not towering, but present. "Today," he said, "we begin again." The class moved through warm-ups, then kata, and eventually light sparring. And throughout, Wadonab walked among them differently. He offered corrections gently. He watched more than he spoke. When Daiki stumbled during a sequence, Wadonab didn't call it out. He waited, watched the boy reset himself, then quietly stepped in and helped him adjust his stance. Daiki looked up at him a little surprised. Wadonab smiled. "You've got it," he said simply. The boy nodded. At the end of the class, Wadonab bowed them out and stood quietly as the students began to gather their gear. Then he called out. "Daiki," he said, "would you stay a moment?" The boy froze, his classmates giving him curious looks before they filtered out. Daiki approached the center mat, clutching the signed white belt in his small hands. Wadonab knelt down to meet his eyes. "You know why Mr. Norris came here?" he asked. Daiki shook his head slowly. "Was it because I was bad?" Wadonab's heart clenched at the words. "No," he said gently. "He came because you try harder than anyone, because you keep standing back up." Daiki looked away, blinking quickly. "Sometimes I think I'll never be good." Wadonab placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you're already better than you think. Mr. Norris told me your grandfather asked him to come. He wanted you to know that your effort matters, that someone noticed." Daiki swallowed hard. "Will he come back?" Wadonab smiled. "I don't know, but I think he left something here that will stay with us." Daiki nodded slowly, hugging the belt to his chest. Wadonab reached into his gyup pocket and pulled out a small item wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it and handed it to the boy. It was a tiny wooden plaque, carved with the same Vietnamese phrase Chuck had written, "Su im lang labai hok lon nat." Daiki traced the letters with his finger. "The silence was the loudest lesson," Wadonab translated. "Your grandfather said you'd understand it better as you grew, but I think you already do." Daiki's lips curved in a soft smile. He bowed deeply. "Thank you, Sensei." Wadonab returned the bow. As the boy left, Wadonab stood again in the quiet. He looked towards the trophy case, not to admire, but to reflect. The medals were still there, but they felt different now. They were no longer the goal. They were simply markers of a journey that never truly ends. That evening, the assistant instructor who had filmed the sparring match stood in his office staring at the footage on his tablet. His finger hovered over the upload button. It would go viral in seconds. The story of Chuck Norris humbling a dojo master in a single spar. But instead, he tapped the save option and locked the video behind a password. Some things, he thought, aren't meant for the world to consume. Some things are meant to grow slowly, quietly, like a seed planted in humility. Outside the dojo, dusk was falling again. The streets shimmered under the soft light of the street lamps. Somewhere far off, a train passed, its low hum fading into the night. In a small park nearby, a boy named Daiki practiced slow front kicks on his own. The signed belt was tucked into his gym bag. His eyes were focused. His form still wobbled a little, but he didn't stop. He tried again, and again. The moon rose overhead. In another town, miles away, Chuck Norris stood on the edge of a lake, staring at his reflection in the rippling water. He wore a simple hoodie, his breath fogging slightly in the cool air. Behind him, there was no audience. No dojo, no applause, only trees, water, and sky. He closed his eyes and bowed to the wind. Somewhere, he knew, someone had heard the lesson, and that was enough. Back in the dojo, Wadonab turned off the lights for the night. He walked to the mat one last time and bowed, not to anyone visible, but to the lesson that had been left behind. The silence in the room was deep, but within it echoed every movement, every word, every withheld strike. And in that silence, the future began.